Unalaska Island, March 1873. While Russian traders and American fur agents burned through precious driftwood at alarming rates in their drafty wooden cabins, one man sleeps comfortably in what they dismiss as a dirt hole, with nothing but a single seal oil lamp for heat. His Barabara maintains 65 degrees inside, while winds howl at 90 miles per hour, and temperatures plunge to 15 below zero. Alexei Yurkov, a 45-year-old Unangax master builder, digs his entrance tunnel 18 inches lower than everyone else does. He excavates 6 feet deep instead of the standard 4 feet. He builds walls with 2-foot-thick sod blocks, while others use 18-inch standard construction. Russian traders call it wasteful labor. American agents dismiss it as refusing to embrace progress. Even his own neighbors shake their heads. Why make work where none is needed? Then November arrives with the worst winter in living memory. Sustained winds of 100 miles per hour. Temperatures dropping to 25 below. 15 degrees colder than normal. Standard cabins fail. Families crowd into the church, the only heated building left standing. But that dirt hut? It stays warm enough that 13 people shelter there comfortably while the killer storm rages outside. What did this hunter understand about heat, insulation, and survival that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The wind cut across Aleut Bay with the force of a charging walrus, carrying the salt tang of kelp and the promise of another brutal Aleutian winter. Alexei Yurkov stood at the edge of his chosen building site, a weathered sealskin parka whipping around his frame as he studied the ground with the intensity of a hunter reading tracks. At 45, he had built 17 barabaras across 4 islands, each one teaching him something new about the art of staying warm when the world turned cold enough to kill. The spring grass had barely emerged from the volcanic soil when Alexei began his excavation in late March of 1873. While other islanders waited for the traditional building season of late summer, he started digging when the ground still held winter's frost 2 feet down. His neighbors watched with the bemused tolerance reserved for eccentric relatives. Everyone knew Alexei built solid shelters, but this time his methods seemed to defy both reason and tradition. The first sign of his unconventional approach came with the depth of his excavation. Standard Barabara construction called for digging 4 feet into the earth, deep enough to access the ground's stable temperature, shallow enough to avoid the backbreaking labor of moving tons of volcanic soil. Alexei dug 6 feet down, his bone and antler tools scraping against the permafrost line as he carved out a living space that would sit entirely below the frost boundary. When Ivan Petrov, the local Russian-American company agent, rode by on his weekly inspection tour, he reined in his horse to stare at the unnaturally deep hole. "Why waste so much effort digging to China?" Petrov called out, his Russian accent thick with condescension. "Good lumber comes on every supply ship now. A proper wooden cabin takes 1 week to build, not 1 season of digging like a ground squirrel." Alexei paused in his work, straightening slowly as he considered his response. The Russian agent represented everything that was changing in the Aleutians: the push toward imported materials, the dismissal of techniques that had kept his people alive for thousands of years, the assumption that newer meant better. "Ground never burns," he said simply, returning to his excavation. "Ground never blows away in storm. Ground stays same temperature all winter, 38 degrees, always." Petrov shook his head and spurred his horse onward, muttering about the stubborn primitiveness of the natives. But Alexei's comment revealed the first principle underlying his excessive construction: thermal mass. The deeper excavation put his living space entirely within the Earth's stable temperature zone, where the ground maintained a constant 38 degrees regardless of surface conditions. While above-ground structures battled wild temperature swings from 50 above to 20 below zero, his Barabara would remain buffered by the Earth's own thermal battery. The entrance tunnel presented the second departure from standard practice. Traditional Barabara builders dug their entrance passages level with the main floor, creating a straight pathway from outside to the living space. Alexei angled his entrance downward, carving a tunnel that dropped 18 inches below his main floor level before connecting to the central chamber. The extra excavation added days of backbreaking work, but it created something no level entrance could achieve: a cold trap. Dr. William Healy Dahl, the Smithsonian researcher who had been documenting Aleutian culture for the past 8 years, stopped by the construction site in late April. Unlike the Russian agent's dismissive inspection, Dahl's visit carried genuine scientific curiosity. He measured the entrance tunnel's dimensions with his surveyor's chain, sketched the angular descent in his field notebook, and asked detailed questions about airflow patterns. "Cold air is heavier than warm air," Alexei explained, gesturing toward his sloping entrance. "Cold air flows down tunnel, stays at bottom. Warm air stays up in house. Like oil floating on water, they do not mix if you give them different places to go." Dahl nodded slowly, recognizing the sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics embedded in this seemingly simple design modification. The sunken entrance would function as a natural airlock, preventing the direct infiltration of cold air that plagued level entry shelters. He made careful notes, realizing he was documenting an innovation that European builders had never developed despite centuries of cold climate construction. The walls of Alexei's Barabara grew thicker with each passing week. Standard construction used 18-inch sod blocks, thick enough for insulation, but manageable for a single builder to handle. Alexei cut his blocks 26 inches thick, incorporating a 4-inch stone core that required precise fitting and extraordinary physical effort. Each block weighed nearly twice the standard weight, turning wall construction into a feat of endurance. Maria Kochutin, whose own Barabara sat 200 yards away, watched the laborious process with growing bewilderment. She had helped build 8 barabaras over her lifetime, following methods passed down through generations of successful construction. "My grandmother's house stayed warm with 18-inch walls," she called out during one of her visits. "Why make the work so much harder?" Alexei paused in his lifting, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool spring air. "Thicker walls hold more heat," he said, patting the massive sod block he had just positioned. "When storm comes, thick walls keep warm air inside longer. Thin walls lose heat fast when wind pushes cold air against them." The stone cores embedded within his sod walls served a dual purpose that wouldn't become apparent until winter's test. The stones acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night, creating a natural heating battery that would moderate temperature swings. But they also provided structural integrity, preventing the thick walls from slumping or developing gaps that could compromise the thermal envelope. By late September, when other families had long since completed their winter preparations, Alexei was still working on his Barabara's final details. He installed what he called breathing stones, carefully positioned gaps between specific rocks that would allow controlled air circulation without creating thermal breaches. The placement required an understanding of natural airflow patterns that few builders possessed, positioning each gap to work with the prevailing winds rather than against them. The last addition puzzled everyone who witnessed it. As October's first storms approached, Alexei began collecting wet beach grass and seaweed, storing the soggy vegetation in carefully woven baskets near his entrance. Neighbors who had already questioned his excessive construction methods shook their heads at this final apparent folly. Winter preparation meant gathering dry materials, dry wood, dry grass, dry everything. Why would anyone want wet organic matter before the hardest season? Even Father Innocent, the Russian Orthodox priest who had grown fond of Alexei's quiet devotion, expressed concern about the unusual preparation. "My son," he said gently after Sunday service, "perhaps you show lack of faith in providence by working so hard against what God may send. The other families trust in simpler methods and divine protection." Alexei received the criticism with the same patient dignity he had shown all season. His Barabara stood completed as October's storms began to build on the horizon, deeper, thicker, more complex than any shelter built on Unalaska Island in living memory. Whether his innovations represented wisdom or folly, would be determined by the test that approached with each dropping degree of temperature. The Aleutian low settled over the North Pacific like a massive grinding wheel in early November, pulling Arctic air down from the Bering Sea and driving it against the volcanic peaks of Unalaska Island with unprecedented fury. Weather patterns that typically brought manageable winter storms intensified into something far more dangerous. Sustained winds of 80 miles per hour became the new normal, punctuated by gusts that topped 100. The barometric pressure dropped to levels that made seasoned hunters' joints ache and sent seabirds fleeing to sheltered coves days before each storm's arrival. Ivan Petrov felt the first signs of trouble in his Russian-American company cabin during the third week of November. Built according to standard colonial specifications with imported lumber from Sitka, the structure had weathered 5 previous winters without serious problems. The walls consisted of overlapping horizontal logs chinked with moss and clay, topped by a steep pitched roof designed to shed the region's heavy precipitation. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, connected to a chimney that drew efficiently in normal conditions. But 1873 was proving far from normal. Interior temperatures in Petrov's cabin dropped to 35 degrees despite burning a roaring fire from dawn to midnight. The imported lumber, dried for rapid construction rather than long-term performance, had shrunk and warped over the years, creating gaps that whistled with incoming cold air. Each gust of wind drove frigid drafts through the structure, overwhelming the fireplace's heating capacity. Petrov found himself burning 6 cords of precious driftwood per month instead of his usual 2, yet still waking to find ice forming on the inside walls 3 feet from the hearth. The Volkov family's improved Barabara suffered from different but equally serious problems. Dmitry Volkov had incorporated what he considered the best of both worlds, traditional earth-sheltered construction combined with Russian innovations. His entrance tunnel ran level with the main floor, eliminating what he saw as unnecessary excavation work. The walls rose only 4 feet deep, following standard Barabara dimensions, but using a mixture of sod and imported timber for structural reinforcement. A Russian-style chimney replaced the traditional central fire pit, promising better smoke evacuation and more efficient heating. But as November's storms intensified, the level entrance became a thermal disaster. Each time someone opened the high door covering, cold air poured directly into the living space like water through a broken dam. The shallow excavation left the structure vulnerable to temperature fluctuations, and the chimney system, designed for above-ground use, created a powerful updraft that sucked heated air out of the dwelling faster than the fire could replace it. Maria Volkova found herself burning through their entire winter's supply of seal oil by mid-December, yet the interior temperature rarely climbed above 45 degrees. Dr. Dahl documented the failing systems with scientific precision, taking daily temperature readings that revealed the stark inadequacies of conventional construction methods. His thermometer readings showed interior temperatures in standard cabins fluctuating wildly, dropping from 60 degrees to 35 degrees within hours as storms passed through. The structures consumed enormous quantities of fuel while providing marginal comfort, creating a survival equation that favored the wealthy traders who could afford imported resources over island families dependent on local materials. Meanwhile, Alexei's Barabara performed with mechanical consistency that bordered on the miraculous. His single seal oil lamp, burning no more than 1 cup of oil every 3 days, maintained interior temperatures between 60 and 65 degrees regardless of external conditions. The deep excavation kept his living space entirely within the Earth's stable thermal zone, while the thick sod walls absorbed and stored heat from the ground itself. The sunken entrance functioned exactly as designed, creating a cold trap that prevented frigid air from entering the main chamber. The breathing stones revealed their sophisticated purpose as the storms intensified. Positioned to work with prevailing wind patterns, they created controlled air circulation that prevented dangerous carbon dioxide buildup without compromising thermal efficiency. Fresh air entered through carefully placed gaps on the windward side, while stale air exhausted through corresponding openings on the leeward side. The system maintained breathable air quality while losing virtually no heat, a feat that European ventilation systems would not match for another century. Father Innocent began holding evening services in Alexei's Barabara when the Russian Orthodox Church became too cold for comfortable worship. The priest marveled at the stable conditions, warm enough to remove outer garments, quiet enough to hear whispered prayers, dry enough to prevent condensation on his metal crucifix. "It is like being held in the palm of God's hand," he wrote in his journal. "While the world rages above, here is perfect peace." The contrast became impossible to ignore as December brought even harsher conditions. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero, accompanied by horizontal snow driven by 90-mile-per-hour winds. Standard construction methods reached their breaking point. The Petrov cabin's fireplace consumed a full quart of driftwood every 2 days, yet ice continued forming on interior walls. Windows froze shut, door frames warped from thermal stress, and gaps in the log walls widened as the dried lumber contracted in the extreme cold. 3 families abandoned their failing shelters entirely, crowding in with relatives whose structures still functioned marginally. The American trading post, built with the latest frontier construction techniques, became uninhabitable when its chimney system failed during a particularly violent storm. Fuel shortages developed as families burned through winter supplies at unsustainable rates, creating a cascade of problems that threatened the entire community's survival. Yet Alexei's fuel consumption remained constant: 1 cup of seal oil every 3 days, burned in a simple stone lamp that provided both heat and light. The thermal mass of his thick walls stored ground heat during calmer periods and released it slowly during storms, creating a thermal battery that required minimal energy input to maintain comfortable conditions. His breathing stone ventilation system continued operating flawlessly, powered entirely by natural air pressure differences created by the wind itself. Dr. Dahl's measurements documented the extraordinary performance gap between traditional and conventional methods. While standard structures showed thermal efficiency ratings of 40%, meaning 60% of generated heat was lost to the environment, Alexei's Barabara achieved 92% efficiency. The numbers represented more than academic interest. They quantified the difference between survival and catastrophe in conditions that were growing more dangerous with each passing storm. As January approached with forecasts of even worse weather, desperate neighbors began paying closer attention to the one structure on Unalaska Island that seemed impervious to nature's assault. Warm air continued rising from Alexei's entrance tunnel, even during the worst storms, a visible sign of comfort in a landscape of failing shelters and dwindling fuel supplies. The storm that arrived on January 15th, 1874, defied every weather pattern in Unangax oral history. The barometric pressure plummeted to levels that Dr. Dahl's instruments had never recorded, while winds screaming in from the Bering Sea reached sustained velocities of 110 miles per hour. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven with such force that it carved channels in exposed rock faces and stripped bark from the few stunted willows that clung to the island's sheltered valleys. Ivan Petrov's cabin lost its roof entirely during the storm's second night. The imported lumber, weakened by months of thermal stress and moisture infiltration, simply disintegrated under the wind's relentless assault. Petrov and his family barely escaped to the trading post before the structure collapsed completely, taking with it their entire winter's supply of food and fuel. The Russian agent who had mocked traditional building methods now found himself homeless, dependent on the charity of neighbors whose own shelters were failing rapidly. The Volkov family's hybrid Barabara became uninhabitable when the level entrance tunnel transformed into a wind channel that drove sub-freezing air directly into their living space. The Russian-style chimney system, overwhelmed by the storm's extraordinary pressure differentials, began drawing heated air out of the structure faster than their fire could compensate. Dmitry Volkov sealed the entrance with boards and blankets, but the modifications that had seemed so clever during construction now became fatal flaws. The family abandoned their shelter on the storm's third day, carrying what possessions they could manage through the driving snow to seek refuge in the Russian Orthodox Church. Father Innocent opened the church to displaced families, as structures failed across the island. 12 people crowded into the building's single heated room, sharing body heat and dwindling supplies while the storm raged outside. The priest's thermometer showed interior temperatures dropping to 28 degrees, despite a fire that consumed their remaining wood at an alarming rate. Condensation from their breath froze on the inside walls, creating an ice shell that reflected their predicament, trapped between the killing cold outside and the inadequate warmth within. The American trading post, considered the most substantial structure on the island, burned through its entire month's fuel supply in 1 week. The building's conventional construction, board and batten siding over a timber frame, provided virtually no insulation against the unprecedented cold. Windows shattered from thermal shock when interior condensation froze and expanded. The trading post manager, a practical man from Maine who had survived harsh winters throughout New England, admitted defeat and moved his family to the church with the other refugees. While the community's conventional structures collapsed or became uninhabitable, Alexei's Barabara weathered the killer storm with mechanical steadiness. His thermal measurements, taken with a simple mercury thermometer that Dr. Dahl had provided, showed interior temperatures holding steady at 62 degrees throughout the storm's worst fury. The reading represented an 87-degree difference from the outside temperature of 25 below zero, a thermal performance gap that conventional construction couldn't approach even under normal conditions. The storm's peak intensity revealed the genius of Alexei's wet grass preparation. As winds reached their maximum velocity, he retrieved the carefully stored beach grass and seaweed from their waterproof baskets. Working quickly during a brief lull in the wind, he spread the wet organic matter across his Barabara's sod roof in a layer roughly 6 inches thick. The moisture froze instantly in the sub-freezing air, creating an impermeable ice shell that eliminated the microscopic gaps between sod blocks where heat could escape. The frozen vegetation formed a windproof barrier that completed his thermal envelope with scientific precision. Where conventional roofs leaked heat through countless small gaps, around rafters, between boards, through poorly sealed joints, Alexei's ice-sealed roof became a single continuous surface. The technique represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about Arctic survival, refined through generations of builders who understood that the difference between life and death often came down to eliminating the last few percent of heat loss. Dr. Dahl braved the storm on its 4th day to take measurements that would later astonish the scientific community. Fighting through wind that knocked him down repeatedly, he reached Alexei's entrance tunnel to find warm air rising visibly from the opening, the only such sign of comfortable habitation visible anywhere on the island. His thermometer readings documented conditions that seemed to defy physics. While the storm raged at lethal intensity above ground, the Barabara's interior remained as stable as a well-designed laboratory. The breathing stone ventilation system continued operating flawlessly throughout the crisis, powered by the storm's own energy. The pressure differentials created by 100-mile-per-hour winds drove fresh air through the windward stones, while exhausting stale air through the leeward openings. Carbon dioxide levels remained safe despite the sealed environment, while humidity stayed low enough to prevent condensation that plagued other shelters. The system represented a masterwork of passive engineering that required no fuel, no maintenance, and no human intervention to function perfectly. Alexei's fuel consumption during the storm remained unchanged, 1 cup of seal oil every 3 days. The thermal mass of his 26-inch sod walls, heated by stable ground temperatures and insulated by the frozen grass shell, required only minimal energy input to maintain comfortable conditions. His single stone lamp provided adequate warmth for the entire living space, a feat that conventional heating systems couldn't match even with unlimited fuel supplies. On the storm's 7th day, desperate neighbors began gathering near Alexei's entrance tunnel, drawn by the visible evidence of warmth and shelter. Dmitry Volkov, the trader who had dismissed traditional methods as primitive, stood in the driving snow, watching warm air rise from the tunnel opening. His own hybrid construction lay abandoned and frozen, a testament to the failure of compromise between traditional wisdom and imported innovation. Father Innocent arrived with 3 families from the overcrowded church, carrying children who showed early signs of exposure and hypothermia. The priest had swallowed his earlier criticism about excessive preparation and divine providence, recognizing that practical wisdom sometimes took precedence over theological considerations. Standing at the entrance to Alexei's Barabara, he could feel warm air flowing upward even through the storm's fury, a tangible promise of survival in a landscape where every other shelter had failed. The moment of reckoning had arrived. One structure on Unalaska Island had proven impervious to conditions that destroyed everything else, and its builder faced a choice that would define not only his own character, but the survival prospects of his entire community. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Fuel supplies across the island had reached critical levels, and temperatures continued dropping toward readings that threatened life itself. Alexei emerged from his Barabara on the storm's 8th morning to find 13 people huddled around his entrance tunnel, their faces showing the gaunt exhaustion of those who had spent too many nights fighting cold instead of sleeping. Father Innocent stood among them, holding a child whose lips had taken on the blue tinge that preceded serious frostbite. Ivan Petrov, the Russian agent who had mocked traditional building methods just months earlier, waited with his family's few remaining possessions bundled in a frozen canvas tarp. The Volkov family clustered together, their breath forming ice crystals that fell like snow in the brutal air. Without a word, Alexei stepped aside and gestured toward his entrance tunnel. The families moved quickly, understanding that survival took precedence over social conventions. As they descended through the angled passage that had been designed for a single family, each person felt the temperature rise with every step downward. By the time they reached the main chamber, coats that had been desperately needed above ground became uncomfortably warm in the stable 60-degree environment. The Barabara's interior, measuring 12 feet by 16 feet with a 7-foot ceiling, had been carefully proportioned for optimal thermal efficiency. Alexei's calculations, based on generations of traditional knowledge refined through personal experience, had determined the ideal volume-to-surface ratio for maintaining heat with minimal energy input. Now that mathematical precision faced its ultimate test as 13 people occupied a space designed for 4. Dr. Dahl, who had joined the refugees during the storm's worst night, documented the extraordinary performance of Alexei's thermal systems under maximum stress. His measurements showed that despite more than tripling the occupancy, interior temperatures remained stable at 60 degrees. The thick sod walls continued absorbing heat from the surrounding earth, while the breathing stone ventilation system automatically adjusted to handle increased carbon dioxide production from additional occupants. The thermal mass that Alexei had built into his walls, tons of earth and stone that absorbed and released heat slowly, proved capable of buffering far greater thermal loads than anyone had imagined. The single seal oil lamp that had heated the Barabara throughout the winter continued providing adequate warmth for all 13 refugees. Dahl's careful fuel measurements showed consumption increasing only marginally, 1 1/4 cups every 3 days instead of 1 cup, representing an efficiency that defied conventional heating theory. The lamp's central position, another traditional technique that Alexei had preserved, radiated heat evenly throughout the space, while the stone floor absorbed and redistributed thermal energy with mechanical precision. The storm's psychological impact on the refugees became as important as its physical challenges. Families who had spent weeks battling cold, burning through fuel supplies, and watching their shelters fail, gradually relaxed in the stable environment of Alexei's Barabara. Children who had been too cold to play for months began drawing pictures in the soft earth floor. Adults who had rationed every piece of food and drop of oil found themselves able to think beyond immediate survival for the first time since November. Alexei shared his knowledge freely during the long storm nights, teaching the practical principles that governed his construction methods. He showed Ivan Petrov how the sunken entrance created a cold trap, using a burning seal oil wick to demonstrate how cold air flowed down the tunnel while warm air remained in the upper chamber. The Russian agent, humbled by the failure of imported building techniques, took detailed notes about thermal dynamics that his colonial training had never addressed. Dmitry Volkov, the trader whose hybrid construction had failed so dramatically, received instruction in the breathing stone ventilation system. Alexei explained how the carefully positioned gaps worked with prevailing wind patterns to create controlled air circulation powered entirely by natural pressure differences. The trader realized that his Russian-style chimney had violated fundamental principles of sealed environment ventilation, creating powerful drafts that sucked heated air from the structure faster than fires could replace it. The women learned about thermal mass and heat storage as they helped prepare meals over Alexei's central fire pit. Unlike the corner fireplaces common in Russian construction, the central heating source radiated warmth equally in all directions, while the stone floor absorbed excess heat during cooking and released it slowly afterward. The system eliminated hot and cold zones that plagued conventional structures, creating uniform comfort throughout the living space. Dr. Dahl's scientific measurements provided objective validation of techniques that had been dismissed as primitive just months earlier. His calculations showed that Alexei's Barabara achieved thermal efficiency ratings of 92%, meaning only 8% of generated heat was lost to the environment. Conventional structures of the era typically achieved 40% efficiency, losing more than half their heating energy to drafts, poor insulation, and inadequate design. The numbers represented more than academic curiosity. They quantified the difference between sustainable heating and fuel crisis in extreme conditions. The storm's duration tested everyone's patience and resources, but Alexei's Barabara provided more than physical shelter. The stable environment allowed normal human activities to continue even during nature's worst assault. Father Innocent held evening prayers in conditions comfortable enough for extended worship. Families shared meals without huddling around fires for warmth. Children slept through entire nights without waking from cold, allowing adults the rest needed to maintain morale and health. As the storm entered its second week, fuel shortages across the island reached crisis proportions. Families who had managed to keep their shelters marginally habitable faced the prospect of burning furniture, books, and eventually structural elements to maintain heat. The trading post's manager calculated that conventional heating methods would exhaust all available fuel on the island within another 10 days if the storm continued. Yet Alexei's Barabara continued operating on the same minimal fuel consumption that had sustained it since November. The social dynamics of shared survival revealed character in ways that normal circumstances never could. Alexei made no mention of the mockery he had endured during construction, focusing entirely on keeping everyone warm and fed. Ivan Petrov acknowledged the superiority of traditional methods without defensiveness, recognizing that pride was a luxury no one could afford when survival was at stake. The families shared food, fuel, and labor with the cooperation that extreme conditions demanded, discovering that the Barabara's design naturally encouraged community cooperation rather than individual competition. When the storm finally began weakening on February 1st, 13 people had survived 2 weeks of the worst weather in recorded Aleutian history, in comfort that conventional construction couldn't provide under normal conditions. They emerged into clearing skies to survey an island transformed by nature's fury, where every structure built according to imported methods required major repairs or complete reconstruction. Only one shelter had weathered the killer storm unchanged, its builder vindicated not through boasting, but through the simple fact that his techniques had worked when everything else failed. Spring arrived on Unalaska Island with the stark clarity that follows catastrophe. As snow melted and winds calmed to normal velocities, the full scope of winter's destruction became visible across the landscape. Every structure built according to conventional methods bore scars from the killer storm: collapsed roofs, shattered walls, foundations shifted by frost heave, and interiors damaged by months of inadequate heating. The Russian-American company trading post required complete reconstruction. Ivan Petrov's cabin existed only as scattered lumber partially buried under snowdrifts. Even the Russian Orthodox Church needed extensive repairs to its storm-damaged roof and cracked foundation stones. Yet Alexei's Barabara emerged from winter looking exactly as it had in fall, its sod walls unmarked by the fury that had destroyed everything around it. The frozen grass and seaweed that had sealed his roof during the storm's peak melted away, leaving the underlying structure intact and ready for another season. No repairs were needed, no maintenance required. The building had simply absorbed nature's worst assault and continued functioning without compromise. The community's response to this demonstration carried none of the mockery that had characterized the previous year. Families began approaching Alexei quietly, asking for instruction in traditional building techniques that they had dismissed as backward just months earlier. Ivan Petrov, tasked with rebuilding Russian colonial infrastructure, requested detailed plans for incorporating earth-sheltered design principles into official construction guidelines. The agent who had once ridiculed dirt holes now recognized that conventional building methods were fundamentally inadequate for Aleutian conditions. Alexei shared his knowledge without reservation, never mentioning the skepticism he had endured during construction. His teaching focused on principles rather than personalities, emphasizing the physics and engineering concepts that made traditional methods superior to imported techniques. He demonstrated excavation techniques that maximized thermal mass while minimizing labor, showed families how to calculate proper entrance tunnel angles for their specific locations, and explained the relationship between wall thickness and fuel efficiency in terms that non-builders could understand and apply. 7 new barabaras began construction during spring of 1874, each incorporating Alexei's innovations while adapting to individual family needs and site conditions. The Volkov family's second barabara featured a sunken entrance 18 inches below the main floor, thick sod walls with stone cores for thermal mass, and breathing stones positioned according to their location's specific wind patterns. Maria Kochudin, the neighbor who had questioned Alexei's excessive wall thickness, rebuilt her family's shelter with 24-inch sod blocks that required weeks of additional labor but promised decades of superior performance. Dr. Dahl documented the knowledge transfer with scientific precision, recognizing that he was witnessing the preservation of engineering principles that mainstream architecture had never developed. His detailed drawings and measurements created the first comprehensive technical documentation of advanced barabara construction, ensuring that innovations developed through centuries of Arctic survival would be preserved for future generations. The Smithsonian researcher understood that traditional knowledge systems often contained sophisticated solutions to problems that formal engineering had yet to solve. Construction techniques spread beyond individual families to influence community infrastructure projects. The rebuilt trading post incorporated earth berming around its foundation, reducing heat loss through the building's base while providing wind protection for the structure's exposed walls. The Russian Orthodox Church added a semi-subterranean addition for winter services, using thermal mass principles to create a heated space that required minimal fuel to maintain comfortable conditions throughout the coldest months. Even Russian colonial administrators, traditionally resistant to adopting native techniques, began incorporating earth-sheltered design elements into official building codes. Reports reaching colonial headquarters in Sitka described the catastrophic failure of conventional construction during the winter of 1873 to 1874, contrasted with the proven success of improved traditional methods. Colonial engineers trained in European building traditions found themselves studying Unangax thermal engineering principles that achieved performance standards their own methods couldn't match. The transformation extended beyond construction techniques to fundamental attitudes about traditional knowledge systems. Families who had eagerly abandoned ancestral methods in favor of imported materials and techniques began recognizing the sophisticated understanding embedded in practices they had dismissed as primitive. The killer winter had demonstrated that newer didn't necessarily mean better, and that survival in extreme environments required solutions developed through generations of successful adaptation rather than theoretical knowledge imported from gentler climates. Dr. Dahl's reports to the Smithsonian Institution documented thermal efficiency measurements that wouldn't be matched by conventional construction for another century. His calculations showed that Alexei's Barabara design achieved heat retention rates of 92%, while consuming 90% less fuel than standard frontier building methods. The numbers represented more than academic curiosity. They quantified innovations that could revolutionize cold climate construction if properly understood and applied by mainstream builders. The human element of the story resonated as powerfully as its technical achievements. Alexei lived to age 89, spending his later years training his grandson and other young builders in traditional construction methods refined through personal innovation. When Russian colonial rule ended and American territorial administration began, local building traditions had been preserved and strengthened rather than lost to cultural disruption. The techniques that saved 13 lives during the killer winter became standard practice throughout the Aleutian chain, spreading from community to community through practical demonstration rather than theoretical instruction. Modern validation of Alexei's innovations came through multiple channels over the following century. University of Alaska researchers studying traditional architecture during the 1960s rediscovered Dr. Dahl's reports, recognizing that 19th century Unangax builders had solved thermal engineering problems that contemporary architects were just beginning to understand. The energy crisis of the 1970s sparked renewed interest in earth-sheltered construction, leading to building techniques that incorporated airlock entrances, thermal mass heating, and controlled ventilation systems pioneered by Arctic peoples generations earlier. Contemporary passive house building standards, developed in Germany during the 1990s, achieved energy efficiency ratings that closely matched measurements Dr. Dahl had recorded in Alexei's Barabara more than a century earlier. The modern movement towards sustainable architecture unknowingly rediscovered principles that traditional builders had refined through practical necessity, proving that environmental challenges often produce similar solutions regardless of cultural context or technological sophistication. The Alaska State Historic Preservation Office eventually listed authentic barabaras as examples of pre-industrial sustainable architecture, recognizing that traditional building methods represented sophisticated engineering solutions rather than primitive construction techniques. The classification acknowledged that indigenous knowledge systems had developed technologies that mainstream culture was only beginning to appreciate, validating approaches that had been dismissed as backward by previous generations of colonial administrators and modernization advocates. Alexei's story closed with a simple truth that resonated across generations and cultures. When survival depends on performance rather than appearance, wisdom lies in what actually works rather than what looks modern or impressive. His innovations succeeded not because they followed fashionable trends or imported theories, but because they solved real problems through patient observation, careful experimentation, and deep understanding of natural systems. The killer winter of 1873 to 1874 became a laboratory that tested competing approaches to fundamental human needs, revealing that traditional knowledge refined through generations of successful adaptation often contained solutions that formal education had never developed.